attention. I want to thank everybody for coming here this afternoon for this public symposium on history and the history of Vermilion Parish and history and culture of Vermilion Parish. This is a component of the Our Town Community History Grant, which the Acadian Museum next door received about a year ago. And included within that grant is a museum exhibit on the history of Erath, which I want to encourage everyone to take the opportunity to come over to the museum after this is finished and see if you have a chance. Another component of the grant is a CD-ROM, which will have the historic photographs and the museum exhibit itself digitally put onto a CD-ROM for preservation purposes and for distribution to local schools and libraries. So this is also a component of this whole Our Town Erath project. As is a video, a Living Traditions video, which is being produced by Kermit Bouillon here. And it is a compilation of various programs which have been put on at the Acadian Museum over the years. And both of these things, actually I should point out that we also have the person who put together the CD-ROM here, Leslie Schilling from the University of Southwestern Louisiana is here. And so both of these components are going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks.
Where will they be available?
If you are interested in getting a copy of either one of those things, come and find me after this is over and I'll take down your phone number and let you know when they're actually done. Otherwise, the Acadian Museum is the place to contact and find out about that. Okay, here today we are having the symposium though, and we have two fantastic speakers. We're very fortunate to have each one of them. Shane Bernard and Barry Onsele, who will be here in the next couple of minutes. But the first speaker is Shane Bernard, and Shane is an expert on Cajun and Creole history. He's written a book, Swamp Pop, Cajun and Creole Rhythm and Blues. He is also currently working on another book on recent Cajun history with the help of funding from the LEH. So, like the LEH helped with the funding, provided funding for this entire project here, they're also helping fund Shane's work, so they're doing some very good work here in Southwest Louisiana. Shane also is the editor of the Encyclopedia of Cajun Culture, and if anybody has any questions on anything Cajun, this is the place to go. And it's not available in print. It instead is on the World Wide Web as a web page. And so if you're interested in checking this out, you absolutely should do it. And again, come up and talk to either one of us afterwards, and we can give you the address so you can get a hold of that. At any rate, I don't want to prolong this anymore. Shane Bernard will be talking about the Americanization of Cajun culture in Vermilion Parish and the surrounding region.
Thank you. I see a lot of my interviewees in the audience, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I guess. But I would argue, and I've got 60 years of Cajun history to cover in about 30 minutes, so let me get right into it. I would argue that there are three defining events in all of Acadian Cajun history, the whole 400 years of it. That would be the expulsion from Nova Scotia for obvious reasons, the Civil War for less obvious reasons that I can't really get into today, and I would include World War II, and that's the event that the least has been written about so far. Not only for its immediate impact on Cajun and Acadian history, but because of all the trends and events that it set into motion after the war. These trends and events included the Cold War, increased educational attainment, rampant consumerism, the rise of the oil industry, even the rise of rock and roll music, which I'll talk about. These all served as Americanizing agents. And you might say, well, you know, what does all that have to do with Vermilion Parish and Erath and Cajuns? And I would argue after World War II, it had to do everything with this area, because what World War II did was that it immersed all of South Louisiana into mainstream America, increasingly so. And it all began with World War II. And when I say that these were Americanizing agents, by Americanizing or Americanization, I mean that it made the Cajuns more like mainstream Americans found elsewhere in the country. It's kind of an abstract notion, but there was this sort of middle America that we became more like. And this was not unique to this area. All across the nation in the post-war era, people were becoming more and more alike, more and more homogenized, and we were as much a part of that as anywhere else. So let me back up and start with World War II. And we entered World War II, as you know, December 7th, 1941. That's when the U.S. got involved. As an aside, there were actually a few Vermilion Parish residents at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked by the Japanese, two of whom died in the attack. Charles Donald Frederick of Abbeville was actually on the Arizona and died on that ship. Now, how did World War II serve to Americanize the Cajuns? Well, obviously, it drafted eventually most Cajun males between the ages of 18 and 36. And they, you know, suddenly you've got all these young Cajuns who maybe had never strayed more than a few miles from home, being whisked away to places like Arkansas and South Carolina and California to go to boot camp. And they're tossed into platoons with GIs from Brooklyn and God knows where who don't speak any French at all. They're expected to speak English, the Cajuns are. And you can imagine this tended to Americanize Cajuns very quickly. And then, of course, they get sent off all around the world to fight a common enemy alongside these English-speaking Americans from elsewhere in the country. And this was a very intense experience. It tended to change the Cajuns who were servicemen very quickly. There's also the matter of wartime national pride. Whether you were overseas or at the home front, there was this feeling that we all had to pull together. We had to put aside our differences, which included ethnic differences, to defeat a common enemy. And yet at the time, there was this sort of understanding that American meant English speaking. Anybody could be an American, but you had to speak English. That was just sort of the sort of Anglo-Saxonist view of the period. And there was even a slogan that came out at the time: Americans all. You heard that frequently during World War II. It was used on posters and banners and that sort of thing. So this message was always hammered home. We've got to put aside our differences and be one people. Now this had a lot to do with, this had a big impact on Vermilion Parish. By the end of World War II, there were about 4,000 active servicemen from Vermilion Parish who had served in the war. And perhaps as much as 77% of these servicemen were Cajuns. Of that 77%, 75% apparently spoke French as their first language. Now, some of these Cajuns have told me that they were made fun of during the war because of their accent, because of their difficulties with speaking English. There's one fellow, Rayo Mo from Kaplan, who recalled, "I couldn't express my thoughts and my feelings well in English, so I really couldn't talk to anyone. No one else in my outfit spoke French." And you really did have, in some instances, a single Cajun soldier ending up in a platoon, the rest of the soldiers of which were from Brooklyn or somewhere else in the Midwest, and they didn't know who this guy was or what kind of language he was speaking, and it forced those Cajuns to learn English very quickly. And there were, however, some Cajuns who found their French-speaking abilities of use during the war. One of them is Robert LeBlanc of Abbeville. He's the head of the emergency preparedness here and what used to be called civil defense. The military actually tapped his French-speaking abilities. He was first put to work censoring mail that had to do with the invasion of North Africa, and then the OSS, which is the forerunner of the CIA, recruited him and sent him behind German lines, disguised as a French peasant, and he would liaison with the French resistance and teach them how to shoot firearms and that sort of thing. There was another LeBlanc from Vermilion Parish, Sidney LeBlanc, who came back he had been a platoon leader during the war. He came back to Vermilion Parish in 1944, having seen combat on the front lines, and he told a civic group in Abbeville that year, quote, "While in Africa, I learned that we in Abbeville speak very good French. Our group had to train some French soldiers, and as the officer in charge knew I spoke French, I was picked to help. When I was introduced to the French officer, I spoke to him in his native tongue, and later was surprised to see he and another officer with their heads together gesturing toward me. Finally, he came over and asked me where I had learned to speak French. He said for an American, I had an unusual accent. I told him we all spoke French at home, and then he told me that the French I spoke was 17th century French that had been forgotten in France. Now, LeBlanc was clearly proud of the contribution he had played to the war effort using his knowledge of French. But in general, it seems to me that the war served to decrease the perceived importance of Cajun French and its culture. For example, Joel Fletcher, the president of USL, who was very much a supporter of Cajun culture at that early time, he spoke out against the returning Cajun students to USL for Americanizing their last names. They were saying Pre-Jean and Trahan, much like you hear in East Texas. He was telling them in the SLI newsletter, look, stop doing that. You know, don't destroy your beautiful ethnic surnames by mispronouncing them like Anglo-Saxons do. Pronounce them the way, you have always done that. And there's a really good example of how the war affected Cajuns on a personal level. Again, this comes from the New Iberia newspaper, September 1945, right after the World War II. The newspaper wrote, "From the Bayou country, he could speak only French when he joined the Army. Now loveless Viatar masters English better than the average GI. As Viatar himself recalled, quote, our officer gave us Cajuns orders in French, and we got along all right. But one day the general came past and stopped. He listened and smiled. He said we were doing all right, but the orders had to be given in English." And the Meridian reported, the Iberia paper reported, quote, "The last time Viatar visited his home on furlough, he got mixed up on his French. Quote, it took me about half an hour to get it right." So here's a guy who knew English. No, he didn't know any English until he went off to war. When he came home, he had almost forgotten how to speak French. That's a perfect example of how World War II served as an Americanizing agent. So now the war ends. We get into the Cold War, and like World War II, the Cold War served as an Americanizing agent by prompting Americans again to put aside their ethnic differences to fight a common enemy, this time communism. And like World War II, the Cold War era was a period of intense Americanism. And so fearful of the communists were Americans in general that it gave rise to this national witch hunt, this effort to ferret out any perceived subversion that it led to what we call McCarthyism after Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, who spearheaded the movement to weed out communists from American society. No longer isolated, increasingly swept up in the currents of mainstream U.S. history, Vermilion Parish actually saw McCarthyism at work. Some of you may know who Dr. Jaworski is. He was a veterinarian. He was from the Ukraine. He settled in this area in the 1950s and immediately fit in. He even, guy's well known for winning several $100,000 on TV. He was a brilliant man, could pick up languages very quickly, and actually picked up quite a bit of Cajun French. So he fit into the society perfectly. Now, he had fled the Ukraine because the communists had taken it over. They had thrown his father in jail. They had confiscated his family's property. His father had been a pro-democratic activist in the Ukraine. So here this Ukrainian American settles in Vermilion Parish, and he spoke all over the country about the evils of communism. He had been awarded the Gold Medal of Americanism bestowed by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and yet when he ran for Senate, state Senate, in the early 1960s, he lost amid rumors circulating here in Vermilion Parish that he was indeed himself a communist. As it turns out, the rumors were started by an Abbeville grocer who told customers, quote, I hope that damn communist Dr. Jaworski loses the election because they said he was a communist. That's the way the communists operate. They send people over here and excite the locals. Sashaworski sued the Abbeville grocer and won. But what's interesting is that although both Sashaworski and the grocer were non-Cajuns, the judge, the lawyers, and almost all the witnesses were Cajuns. And the courtroom transcripts show, as these judges, lawyers, and witnesses spoke, that they had been indoctrinated with this anti-communist fervor. For example, when one Cajun witness was asked what communist meant, she replied, and this is about a 20-year-old Cajun girl, her last name was DeQueer, she says, "I think it's one of the lowest things that a person could possibly be. As a matter of fact, I think it's even lower than a thief or a murderer because, well, he supports communism, and communism doesn't believe in God, and they want to control the whole country like we were taught in books." And you see this repeatedly in the testimony as one person after another is brought up to testify. Even Ignatius A. Martin, who was the pastor of Abbeville's St. Magdalene Catholic Church, when he got up to testify as a witness, he said that communist was, quote, a bad word akin to thief or, to use the vernacular, an SOB or bastard or something like that. Excuse the language. So you can see how this area had been immersed in this Cold War rhetoric and way of thinking. The Cold War brought to Vermilion Parish not only a fear of communism, but a fear of nuclear destruction. By spring of 1962, Acadian had 360 public fallout shelters. You could find them in Cajun, Kaplan, Abbeville, Delcombe, and Erath, as a matter of fact. In fact, there were 18 public fallout shelters in Vermilion Parish by 1962. Half of them were in Abbeville. There were another 4 in Kaplan. There were 3 in Cajun, and Delcombe and Erath each had 1. And by coincidence, the one fallout shelter in Erath was the old bank building, which is now the Acadian Museum right behind us. So I can't figure out how it could have been one. I've heard that they planned to pour dirt on top of some of the buildings too. There's no basement, I think. Is there one? So the fear of nuclear attack in Vermilion Parish was real. So real, in fact, that when in the mid-1950s on a spring night when a glowing meteor zoomed overhead and crashed into West Cote Blanche Bay with a huge explosion, some Vermilion Parish residents were absolutely certain that Louisiana had been attacked by a Russian nuclear bomb. There are lots of reports regarding this event in the local papers, and in fact, as far north as Opelousas it was reported. And Earl Como of Kaplan recalled when he saw the explosion, quote, "It dawned on me that this was the flash of an A-bomb exploding. Since it was in the east, I immediately thought of Baton Rouge, a prime target of the Russians. They would be after the petroleum plants there." Well, Como immediately woke his wife, and I should say that Como had just served in the Strategic Air Command as a radio man or navigator on a bomber carrying weapons targeted for Moscow rail yards. This guy knew about nuclear war and what it did. So he told his wife, he did the calculations in his head, and he says, "Look, I know how fast the speed of sound is and all this stuff. I saw the flash. If my calculations are correct, we should be hearing a boom any minute now, any second now, and if that happens, we know for certain that we've been nuked." Well, he says, "No sooner was that said than a great boom shook the house. I was convinced that we had been attacked by the Russians." Gathering their children, they huddled around the TV waiting for official word of doomsday, but it never came. And the next day they heard on the radio or just from neighbors about the meteor. And Como wrote, "How terrified I had been for my family and myself. How ridiculous my reaction to a natural occurrence. But this just goes to show you how, again, we were being swept up in what was going on all across the country." Also after World War II, we have the rise of consumerism. There's another Americanizing influence. By the late 1940s and early 50s, the Cajuns began to buy into the American dream. Wartime spending had ended the Great Depression. The U.S. emerged from World War II as the only major industrialized nation that didn't have its infrastructure heavily bombed out. We emerged not only a military superpower, but an economic superpower, and this affluence spread throughout the United States. You had also the GI Bill of Rights for World War II vets and later for Korean War vets. This allowed the vets to continue their educations. They could graduate, use the money to graduate from high school. They could use the money to graduate from trade school or college. They could use the money to buy houses or businesses, and through these means prospered more than they ever could have before. And just to give an example of how that affected Cajuns locally, as far as education is concerned, war veterans accounted for about half of the total enrollment at SLI, now USL, in 1947. At the same time, you've got the oil industry booming. The boom started right before World War II, but then you had the need for petroleum during the war for all the airplanes and battleships and that sort of thing, and it continued after the war as automobiles proliferated throughout the society. And Cajuns went to work in the oil industry, and for the first time, many of them had well-paying salaried jobs. And as a result of all this, the Cajuns, for the first time, were able to acquire material wealth like other Americans who were doing the same thing at the same time. They bought modern homes, they bought automobiles, clothes washers, clothes dryers, refrigerators, freezers, and that most Americanizing of appliances, the TV. In fact, between 1950 and 1960, the percentage of Acadiana residents, black and white, Cajun, non-Cajun, who owned a TV jumped from less than 1% in 1950 to nearly 80% only 10 years later. And of course, what are they doing? They're watching I Love Lucy and all these shows piped in from, or broadcast in from New York and Hollywood, where people don't talk Cajun French. So all of this acquisition of material goods was very much against traditional Cajun culture, as Carl Brazzo talks about in Founding of New Acadia and From Acadian to Cajun, his two books. This was not something that Cajuns traditionally did or did their Acadian ancestors. They were anti-materialistic. They believed in only working hard enough to subsist, not to acquire all of this unnecessary stuff. Well, all of a sudden, in the late 40s and early 50s, Cajuns are buying into the American dream, and they're wanting to acquire all of these luxury goods. Now, who among Cajuns better personified this than Dudley LeBlanc from Vermilion Parish, politician, cultural activist, and business entrepreneur extraordinaire. No matter how you feel about Dudley LeBlanc's business practices, you have to admit that he embraced mainstream American culture with a vengeance. So much so that he beat Les Américains at their own game, selling off Hadacol to a bunch of Wall Street tycoons right before the bottom fell out. So now, most Cajuns in the post-war period wanted these newfangled items. You find that repeatedly when you go look in the newspapers and whatnot. There's no resistance on the part of Cajuns whatsoever. And the perfect example of this, there is no better example, Pecan Island and how it reacted to consumerism. Pecan Island was inaccessible by automobile until 1951. It had no electricity until 1954. Because of its isolation and the lack of electricity, it had been entirely without modern conveniences, while the rest of Acadiana had been slowly accumulating all these items. But as soon as electricity arrived, its roughly 400 residents wholeheartedly embraced consumerism. The Lafayette Progress newspaper, which no longer exists, sent a reporter there to Pecan Island the day the electricity was turned on. And this reporter wrote an article titled, "Age of Electricity Comes to State's Last Frontier." And this reporter noted, TV sets, deep freezes, electric ranges, automatic washers, and electric irons came in almost as quickly as did the last of the electric poles and lines. And the reporter noted that the island moved, quote, from the primitiveness of yesterday to the luxury of today as quickly as it took to flip a switch. One resident told the reporter, quote, "I've used the scrub board to wash my clothes too long. The first appliance we're buying is an automatic clothes washing machine." 3 years later, when a reporter visited the island, who apparently had no knowledge of the fact that the community had only recently been electrified, one of the first things she noticed just offhandedly was TV antennas silhouetted against an overcast sky at sundown. Now, I mentioned rock and roll earlier, and this is also an Americanizing agent. The Cajuns who were most rapidly Americanized were young Cajuns, especially Cajuns who were just coming of age in the 1950s. And they grew up watching TV, watching movies, Howdy Doody and whatnot. They listened to rock and roll music made by people like Elvis Presley, Fats Domino, Little Richard. And in the process, they ended up making their own kind of music, which is today called swamp pop. It's a blend of traditional Cajun and even black Creole music, a little bit of country and western music, and rock and roll and rhythm and blues. And it was just sort of the natural result of what happens when mainstream American culture collided with Cajun French culture. And one of these young Cajuns who made this music was a Vermilion Parish resident named Robert Charles Guidry, who was a child listening to Cajun music, but as a teen got turned on to this new rhythm and blues music being broadcast in from New Orleans and the X stations along the Texas border. And he promptly changed his name to an Anglo-American stage name Bobby Charles and wrote a song called See You Later Alligator, which became an international hit. And he's from Vermilion Parish. Another Vermilion Parish resident who embraced this sound was Warren Scheck-Snyder. He began playing Cajun country music in the early 50s or late 40s with Larry Brasso and the Rhythmaires. In the 50s, when he was a teenager, he heard this new rock and roll music and switched over right away and changed his name to Warren Storm, a name he still performs under today. And you can see his picture in the museum. So this preference for rock and roll music among young Cajuns reflected their Americanization. And as one Erath resident noted about growing up in the 50s, quote, "It wasn't cool to speak French. I wanted to get into the American way of life." And this was very common throughout Acadiana at that time. Now, just to wrap things up, I want to point out that the cumulative effect of all these Americanizing agents, World War II, the Cold War, increased educational attainment, consumerism, the coming of the oil industry, rock and roll music, and others that I don't have time to get into today, was that by the 1960s, most younger Cajuns were almost completely Americanized. There were other Americanizing agents, like I said, one of which I'll just mention offhand, transportation improvements. You had the coming of the jet age, you had the coming of I-10 through South Louisiana, you had the proliferation of automobiles, which made people more mobile. It made outsiders, it made it easier for them to get into our area, it made locals, it made it easier for them to move to East Texas or Atlanta or wherever. And this was another Americanizing agent. Anyway, and it helped to erode the cultural barriers to South Louisiana. By the late 1960s, when I was born, Cajun children resembled children found throughout mainstream America. They watched the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island on TV. They ate food out of cans and boxes bought at supermarkets that were paid for with checks and credit cards. And they almost all spoke English as their first language. Not many more spoke it as a second language. And I know I grew up in Lafayette, which is a little more urban. Most of my friends were Cajun, and I'm a Cajun, and none of us spoke French. And if we did ever pick it up, we usually picked it up in high school or college. And I would argue that it's the decline of the Cajun French dialect that most reflects the impact of Americanization on traditional Cajun culture. This decline stems from the Americanizing influences that I already discussed, but it also stems from the widespread practice of teachers punishing Cajun children for speaking French at school, a practice that took place from as early as the 1920s to as late as the late 1950s. I found an example of children being punished in Pierre Park in 1958. That's the latest example that I know of. I don't believe that there was a state government conspiracy or a conspiracy on the part of the State Board of Education to stamp out Cajun French. I think that what happened is that individual school boards, principals, and teachers acted on a local level. And I say this because I've only got circumstantial evidence, but you can see that in some parishes, in some districts, at some schools, children were punished, but next door, they weren't punished. So it was very inconsistent. They may not have been punished, they may have been encouraged to speak English, which is not quite the same thing. But anyway, this punishment was widespread, and it did occur in Vermilion Parish. And as Alan Simon of Mo recalled, and he's sitting right there, he told me that his principal, quote, is talking about his elementary school principal, he didn't speak any French. He didn't care about French, and he was very strict. If you were caught speaking French at school, he'd come down on you with both feet. There was no hem or hawing. You were punished. Now, punishment at Seamoss School varied. You could be called names like swamp rat or boogalee. Again, this is the teacher calling the students this. Boogalee means country hick. You might write lines. I must not speak French on the school grounds. You might be forced to kneel in the corner. You might be slapped with a ruler. This seems to be the international symbol for being punished for speaking French, because the teacher would make you put your fingers together like this and then hit you with a ruler. You might be forced to kneel on kernels of corn or on chalk. I've heard about students having to walk around the flagpole carrying bricks in their hands, run laps around the school gym. Even one principal who beat his students with an inner tube from a bicycle tire for speaking French. Seamoss principal also doubled as their math teacher, and if he caught students speaking French in the math class, he'd make them come to the board and work out an elaborate math problem, the answer to which inevitably came out to be 15, because he knew the students would pronounce it 15 with a Cajun accent, and that was just sort of a way of making fun of them. He hoped to humiliate them into speaking what he considered proper English. So as a result of this practice and all the Americanizing agents I talked about, the number of young Cajuns speaking French as first language plummeted during the post-World War II period. And I want to show you this chart. It's not as complicated as it looks, okay? This is a chart measuring at any given time the percentage of young Cajuns speaking French. This is based on census data. And you can see that this dark line in the middle represents the World War II era. From around 1900 to the World War II era, there's a 19% drop in the number of young Cajuns speaking French. Very slight decline. Then you hit World War II, and it just nosedives. All right? Now, in the 35 years up to the World War II period, it went down, the percentage of young Cajuns speaking French went down about 20%. In the same amount of time after World War II, it went down 50%. All right? So by the time I was born in 1967, we're down to 12% of young Cajuns speaking French as their first language. And by 1981, 85, by that age group, it's down to about 3%. Now, we don't know how many, through census data, spoke French as a second language, but I would argue that the statistics are comparably low. This is one reason why it'll be interesting to see what the effect of French immersion has had. These statistics do not take into account the effect that French immersion has had, because it was just getting off the ground in 1990 when these statistics were collected. So it'll be interesting to see if there's an upward tick in the results when the year 2000 census statistics are released. There's usually like a 3-year delay, so it'll be around 2003 when that comes out. Now, I should mention briefly that in the 1960s, there was a national explosion in ethnic pride. Across the U.S., ethnic groups began to demand their rights, to reclaim their heritage, and to express ethnic pride openly, which was something new. The Cajuns, as now might be expected, were swept up in this national movement. For example, Codeville, the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, was founded by Cajuns in 1968. By no coincidence, this is the same year that Native Americans founded the AIM, the American Indian Movement. It's the same year that the federal government passed the Bilingual Education Act and the Bilingual Bicultural Act. This is something, this sort of ethnic awakening was happening throughout America in the 1960s. It was not merely a local South Louisiana occurrence. It stemmed in part from the civil rights movement. You had black activists showing other ethnic groups how to mobilize for their ethnic groups' rights. And it also stemmed, I would argue, from the hippie counterculture, because even if you didn't like hippies, their message sort of permeated throughout mainstream society, especially by the 1970s. People who were definitely not hippies were still wearing bell bottoms and growing long sideburns and starting to pick up on some of these ideas. And what you had was sort of a rebellion against the consensus and the conformity that exemplified the 1950s. And this allowed people to embrace their heritage after having, perhaps for most of their lives, ignored it or suppressed it. Most people in the 50s felt that they needed to be sort of white bread Americans, and they needed to be sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in outward appearance, if not in actuality. So you had a backlash against this, and the Cajuns were very much part of it. You saw this not only in the founding of Codeville, but in the first tribute to Cajun music, which happened in 1974, which was a turning point in Cajun history, because you had the Cajun people on a grassroots level in mass re-embracing their heritage. You had the rise of Cajun Power, which was a slogan that appeared on everything from T-shirts to license plates to bumper stickers. Edwin Edwards used it as his rallying cry when he ran for the governor's office in 1972. And when he made his speech on the steps of the state capitol after winning the election, he dwelt quite a while on the fact that he was the first Cajun to occupy the office. I wouldn't consider Alexander Mouton or Paul Hebert, who were 19th century governors of Acadian descent, I wouldn't consider them Cajuns. They were sort of genteel Acadians. But Edwards, to me, was the first Cajun to reach that high office, and he was very much aware of that fact. And this sort of ethnic awareness was present everywhere in Acadiana. You could see on Channel 3, you could see Policar, who was sort of a Cajun clown entertaining young children with skits and cartoons. You had Cajun comic strips in the Advertiser and other newspapers around here, such as the Becca Duke and Friends cartoons, which came out, these bilingual cartoons. You had George Rodrigue and Floyd Saunier doing their Cajun-themed art. You had Barry Oswald beginning his field work, collecting Cajun folklore in the small towns around here. You had the state legislature in the early 70s officially defining the borders of Acadiana for the first time, saying it's this 22-parish area. And you had the legislature also adopting as its official flag the Acadian flag, which you now see everywhere. All of these signs of ethnic revitalization occurred between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s. This trend has been called the Cajun Revival or the Cajun Renaissance, during which the Cajun people reacted against Americanization to reclaim their heritage and to reevaluate themselves as a people. Unfortunately, Americanization did not stop with this. It continued, it continues today. It doesn't really seem to show any signs of stopping. In fact, I would argue that it seems to be increasing. As a result, the future of the Cajun people remains unclear. Will the culture come back stronger than ever, say, thanks to French immersion and all the other efforts that are going on? Will it die out completely in a few generations? Or is there some middle ground in which, for instance, Cajun culture survives, but only in a symbolic way, as something to be brought out on special occasions merely for show? Nobody can say for certain. And this is something that other ethnic groups throughout the United States are also dealing with right now. But I think that this leads perfectly into Professor Oswald's presentation on why it's so important that we preserve our history as a people. So that's about it. By the way, I'm teaching a class on Cajun and Creole history at USL in the fall, which we talk about this subject at length. And I do have some flyers on the class if anybody wants to have one.